Free will is unfalsifiable, and that's why you should not believe in it. Let me explain. Let's first assume that there is a physical reality out there that is outside of ourselves. That, for example, the chip that I'm holding right now really exists and that I can measure it and observe it. So if that's the case, then that means that there are certain claims that are falsifiable, claims that I can gather evidence or run experiments to show that this is true or false. An example of a falsifiable claim could be all swans are white. So this claim is easily falsifiable because you could find any other swans that are a different color than white, and that would falsify the claim. Another example would be that this miracle drug cures cancer. So you could run a clinical trial, and if it doesn't cure cancer, or if it's not more effective than the other drugs that we have, then you could say that this claim is false. But there are also unfalsifiable claims, claims that no matter the evidence that you provide or the experiments that you run will not be able to falsify to prove that the claim is false. For example, an example of an unfalsifiable claim would be, well, I was a dog in my previous life. There's no evidence you can bring forward or no experiment that you can run that would disprove that I was a dog in my previous life. Another example would be the claim that souls exist. Since souls are usually thought to be immaterial, that means that we can't really measure it, we can't really run experiment with it or make predictions about it because it's immaterial. Therefore, that means that the claim is unfalsifiable. So now let's say that your buddy John tells you that he's been abducted by aliens, and the reason why people usually don't talk about being abducted by aliens is because they wipe your memory afterwards. But they must have made a mistake with him because he doesn't remember the details, but he still remember having this feeling of being abducted, right? So what would you classify this claim as? Well, this claim would be unfalsifiable because the fact that there's no evidence is a core part of the claim, so there's nothing you can do to falsify it. So now, why exactly is it bad the vast majority of the time to believe in an unfalsifiable claim? Well, the reason is that if you can justify believing in one unfalsifiable claim, you could probably justify believing in a bunch of other falsifiable claims. Because let's say, for example, you believe that the emperor was anointed by God. Well, what's stopping you from believing also that your neighbor is the reincarnation of Jesus? There's nothing really preventing you. And that's why to make progress, you need falsifiable claims that you can then gather more data, run some experiments, and then replace with a better falsifiable claims. And that's one of the reasons why we've been able to create technologies that would have seemed impossible 2,000 years ago or impossible to imagine. Because if you think about it, let's say that all biologists believe that the reason why we're alive is because of an immaterial life force. Well, since this concept of life force is unfalsifiable, well, there will be no more progress because there's no more evidence to gather or experiments to run. And that's why believing in an unfalsifiable claim is not good. So every time that you encounter a claim, you need to ask yourself, what exactly could make this claim false? If there's something that could make this claim false, something that is doable, then congratulations, it's falsifiable. But if there's nothing or nothing short of magic that could falsify this claim, then unfortunately you have an unfalsifiable claim. So now let's go back to the main question of this video. Is free will unfalsifiable? Well, let's ask the question, what exactly could falsify free will? Could studies that show that humans are predictable in some ways falsify free will? Because there are studies that show that the more adverse childhood events you go through, the more likely you are to be an alcoholic in adulthood, the more likely you are to be prescribed antidepressants, to perpetrate domestic violence, to smoke as an adult, and to attempt suicide. So does that falsify free will? Could that falsify free will? Well, any proponents of free will would say no, because obviously humans are influenced by their environments. If they weren't, that wouldn't really make sense. Because if, for example, it rains outside, well, obviously people will be more likely to grab an umbrella as they are going out. So if you make a study that shows that, well, when it rains outside, there's a higher proportion of people that grabs an umbrella when they're going out. That wouldn't really prove anything. That would just show that humans are using their free will to make rational choices. Now, could something like physics disprove free will, falsify it? Well, physics could poke some holes into the concept of free will by showing that it goes against the law of cause and effect, but people, proponents of free will, could just say, well, of course, humans are special and free will allows us to do certain things that other beings or other things in the universe cannot do. So that also wouldn't falsify free will. So let's ask the question again, what exactly could falsify free will? Can, for example, learning more about the brain ever allow us to falsify this concept? Well, there's a big problem when it comes to studies about the brain and free will, because every time that you do something as a human, right? Every time that, for example, I raise my arm, what happens is that there's a signal that is sent from my brain to the muscle in my arm, and then it contracts that muscle, and that's why I'm able to raise my arm. If I were able to show that there is a signal that goes from my motor cortex down to my arm, well, that wouldn't really prove anything, because that would also happen in a brain with free will. Actually, if you were able to raise your arm without any brain activity, that would be a miracle. So to prove free will, you would need to find an effect in your brain that has no prior causes. So for example, effect 1, if there's no cause 1, then for all intents and purposes, we can assume that this could be attributed to free will. So to find those effects that are uncaused, you would need perfect neural prediction. And the reason why you need that is because if you find an effect that is uncaused, someone could just say, well, we just don't understand enough about the brain, so it could be caused, but we just don't know, right? So with neural prediction, if you cannot find any uncaused activity, then that would actually falsify free will. But if you can find certain uncaused activity, then for all intents and purposes, again, that could be attributed to free will. But here's the problem. Here's the main problem with this, and that's what makes free will unfalsifiable. And the problem is that the brain, our brain, is a chaotic system. What that means is that the slightest little change in the initial condition could dramatically change the behavior of the system. For example, as you can see here, this is a presentation of a chaotic system where you have 3 double pendulum, and they all seem to start at the same place, but they exhibit different behavior. So since the brain is a chaotic system, to have perfect neural prediction, you would need to have a tool that is infinitely accurate, which is not possible. So if we go back to the question that we can ask ourselves, what could make this claim false? Unfortunately for free will, it's either nothing or magic, having a magical tool that could perfectly predict someone's behavior. And that's ultimately why free will is unfalsifiable. So now, what exactly should we do with this information? Because if you're clever enough, you might realize something. You might say, wait a minute, if that's the reason why free will is unfalsifiable, well, the claim that human behavior is determined is also unfalsifiable, because we would need perfect neural prediction to also prove or disprove this claim. And you would be correct. So what exactly should we believe in? Well, let me give you an analogy. So weather is also a chaotic system. So any small variations at the beginning will lead to big variations at the end. So that's why weather forecast, the further it is in time, the less accurate it'll be. So someone could make the claim that actually weather is not deterministic. Weather is freely chosen by Mother Nature. And this claim would also be unfalsifiable, just like the free will claim. But because this analogy is more detached from our human experience, it's easier for us to see that, well, just because you can make the claim that Mother Nature controls the weather, that doesn't mean that I'll just suspend my belief about what causes the weather. Because I have more evidence on the side that weather is something that can be predicted than on the side that weather is controlled by Mother Nature. So I'll choose that because there's people whose sole job is to predict the weather, and they're doing a quite decent job at it. And I think we should do the same thing with free will. Instead of assuming that something that is unfalsifiable exists, we should instead assume that human behavior is most likely either determined or random. And then we can use that to make actual falsifiable claims. For example, the one I just showed at the beginning, this claim that the more adverse childhood events you experience, the more likely you are to be alcoholic, is falsifiable. So we should focus on that instead of believing in free will.